We've had a very circular argument around all of this. Joining me on my panel, Shadow Minister for Financial Services, Stephen Jones, and Liberal Senator James Paterson. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you, Patricia.
Great to be with you.
I want to start with you, Stephen. Why is Labor revealing its 2050 emissions reduction target before all of the many years before? I mean, that is a long time away. Shouldn't you be telling us what you're going to do before that?
Look, I think people have got to get a good sense of what we stand for, and after the summer that we've just been through, I think collectively Australia is asking for some direction, and we as an alternative government feel obliged to say, well, we're going to give some direction. This is what we know the country has to do. We agree with every state Liberal Premier, in fact every Premier around the country, 73 other countries around the world, and the major emitting companies here in Australia, including Qantas and BHP and Santos. We agree with them. We've got to have a long-term target. Now, in your introduction, you said, why don't we go to a 2030 target first? And I want to respond to that. The fact is, there's a couple of big things that are going to happen this year. We've got the renegotiation of the Paris Treaty, a big conference, international conference at the end of the year. We want to see what the near-term objectives are at those international conferences. We also want to see what the government is going to do to see what additional spade work is going to be left for an alternative Labor government. Maybe the government is going to adopt Labor's policies and makes the job more bipartisan and more easy. But, you know, we think it is very important that we set a long-term objectives, particularly for regions like mine. I've got to say, high manufacturing, we've got a coal mining industry in my region. We need a long-term direction and a vision about how we're going to transform things between now and then.
James Paterson, your Liberal colleague Dave Sharma says the world needs to get towards net zero emissions by the second half of the century. Do you agree?
Patricia, I think that voters should be very sceptical of any politician, including me and my colleagues in my parliamentary party and the Liberal and National parties, who tell you what is going to happen in 30 years' time. No.
I have to interrupt. It's not about telling us what will happen. It's not crystal ball stuff. It's saying, if I'm elected, this is what I want to happen. This is my intention. That's the question.
Exactly right, Patricia. They are asking voters to judge them on something that won't happen for 30 years' time, when they will no longer be in the parliament. They'll be off in a retirement home somewhere if they're lucky, enjoying their years away. We can't be assessed on something that far out, and it's just silly to think that we should be judged by that. What we should be judged by is things that we can deliver in the much shorter term, because you can hold us to account if we don't achieve those commitments, and you should. But don't listen to us when we say in 30 to 40 to 50 years' time, this is what we'll be able to achieve. It's just nonsensical.
No, but the question is about setting the target in the first place, and of course you'll be judged. Yeah, so it's about intention, right? Do you intend for a zero net carbon future for this country? Is that your intention?
But Patricia, think about how much technology has evolved over the last 30 years. 1990 was 30 years ago, when there were virtually no mobile phones, virtually no one had the internet, some people had fax machines. If someone had told you then what they would promise the country would achieve, or the government would achieve by this year, rightly they wouldn't have been taken seriously, and think about all the change that's happened in that time. The next 30 years are going to be the same again. So don't assess us on meaningless, open-ended commitments over such a long period of time. Hold us to account on things we can actually have a chance to deliver on in the shorter term.
So you don't think you can deliver on reducing emissions dramatically, given the science says that you have to?
Well, let's say that Anthony Albanese wins the next election, has a very long term as Prime Minister. Even he will have no prospect of getting anywhere near close to 2050 as Prime Minister. So no, he can't deliver on something in 2050. What he could deliver on if he wins the next election is something that in 2030, say, which is much closer. And of course, that's what he's unwilling to commit to and unwilling to say. And I think we should be very sceptical of a politician who can't tell you what will happen in 10 years, but can absolutely tell you what should happen in 30 years.
Stephen, it's a reasonable question that Labor is giving us a test which is that far away, but can't really outline something on the way there, because it's the thing with zero net emissions. You need to be reducing to actually make that deadline. I know you've already answered the question in relation to Glasgow, what the world might do and what the government might do, but this isn't it just really a sort of a promise that's fairly meaningless without all of the meat on the bone?
Now, two things. Firstly, we didn't pull this number out of thin air. This is the number that Australia agreed to, that every serious scientist, that every premier around Australia and all the major companies agree is the number we have to reach by 2050 if we are not going to have catastrophic climate change. So we didn't pull it out of the air. We said, well, that's the place we've got to get to. What do we need to do to get there? To James's point, to the point you've just put to me, we do this all the time. We do it in defence policy. We are purchasing defence platforms today, whether they're submarines, whether they're fighter aircrafts, whether they're frigates, which will have a 20, 30, 40-year lifespan. We do it when we build a dam. We don't build a dam and say we're building this dam for the needs of the next 3 years. We do it because we know what the needs are going to be over the next 50 years. So if we know what we're going to have to do in 50 years' time, it's incumbent upon us, it's responsible for us to say, Australia, honestly, this is what we've got to do, and we've got to get on that path. Otherwise, the rest of the world is going to leave us behind, and we will be doing a massive disservice to our kids.
I just want to talk about the minute's silence that the Parliament observed, the issues around family violence, obviously in the wake of this horrendous murder of 3 children and a woman. But there are broader implications, of course, in terms of this nation's work on reducing domestic violence and taking it seriously. James, I want to start with you. Do you think this issue needs to be treated the same way, for instance, terrorism is treated? It needs to be elevated at a national level, and there needs to be bigger investments and law reform?
I think we can pretty safely say, Patricia, that what we have been doing collectively, government, state and federal, Liberal and Labor, over the last few years has not been successful, and that's not to discount the best endeavours and best intentions of everyone involved in this policy space, which is very complex and not straightforward. But clearly, if women and children are still being killed in their homes by their husbands and fathers, then that's unacceptable, and policy needs to change until that's no longer the case. So we should be open-minded to any and all good ideas and suggestions as to how we achieve it, and we should take it extremely seriously at the highest levels.
Stephen Jones?
Yeah, look, firstly I want to say we saw the best of Parliament in the first 15 minutes of question time, probably the worst of Parliament in the hour that followed that. But I think it was a unifying moment. I think the Prime Minister was very genuinely expressing the views of the Australian people and certainly the Parliament, and Anthony Albanese in his reply. I think this is an opportunity for us to revisit some of the things that have been done over the last 6 or 7 years, whether it's cuts to legal aid services or cuts to emergency housing services. Not only restore, but understand where we have to take that further, because it's one thing to say we all abhor family violence. We do. It's also important for us as leaders in this place to lead by example. But there's some practical things we can do as well, restoring legal aid services, putting in place emergency housing and other services for people who need to get out of a bad situation and get their life back on track. I think all of those things need to be looked at. And
James, there's been a lot of controversy about Bettina Arndt and whether she should be stripped of her Australia Day honour in the wake of some controversial comments she made online. Some of your colleagues have said she should be stripped of the honour. Of course, it's done independently, but is it your view she should be?
I think it's appropriate that the Australia Day Council, which hands out the awards, is considering it, and they're doing so on the basis that honorees shouldn't bring the whole process into disrepute. I think that's the right criteria to assess any person against. I don't think generally we should have a political views test for honorees. They come from a wide variety of backgrounds and opinions and perspectives, but if they are becoming a real source of distraction and if they're discrediting the awards, then I think that needs to be looked at very carefully.
And in her case, is that what she's doing?
Yeah, I'm not going to preempt the Australia Day Council, but I should just say very clearly I completely disagree with the sentiments she's expressed about the very tragic death of this young Brisbane family. And in that case, we all know they're independent, but your colleagues say, and they've written to the council, some of them, and said this should happen. Do you think she should be stripped of the honour given the importance of this issue and the message that it sends? Well, most of my colleagues have just asked that the Australia Day Council assess it, and I think that's the right thing to do. I don't think politicians should make the call about whether people should or should not receive these awards. They are independent of politics, and I think that's a good thing. And I have great confidence and faith that the Australia Day Council will carefully assess this and make the right decision.
Stephen Jones, what are your reflections on this?
Look, as a general point of principle, I think James is right. Australia Day awards to have respect and confidence of the Australian people should be independent of the political process. But, you know, sometimes they just get it so wrong, and sometimes the awardee is just so out of step with the Australian values and what ordinary Australian people think about a set of situations that we've just got to call it. And I'm calling it. She shouldn't have got the award, and the comments that she made after that terrible tragedy in Queensland a couple of days ago with the murder of a young woman, her family, just confirmed my view. Totally inappropriate. It should be removed.
Just before I let you go, just some brief comments on coronavirus and, of course, more developments today in relation to the way Italy is responding, Japan and outbreak there. Clearly this is escalating in other places across the world. First to you, James, and you've had some strong comments, Senator, to make about the way China is handling this. Should we be cautious about relaxing bans of people coming from China?
Yes, we should be extremely cautious, Patricia, particularly in light of the news that South Korea, Japan, Italy and Iran are suffering quite severe outbreaks. I think the Australian government should be extremely cautious about any further lifting of restrictions until the medical evidence is very clear that it's safe. I think the Australian people have to be aware that this is about to become potentially a very serious, very global pandemic, and we will take the best medical advice and take the strongest steps necessary to protect the Australian people.
What are your reflections, Stephen Jones? Because clearly there was a small cohort of students who were given an exemption. Do you think there should be wider exemptions?
Look, point number one, we've got to take the advice of the medical experts and the Chief Medical Officer in our science agencies. But as a point, on the point of our dealings with China, this is exactly the circumstance in which we need to have good, open and honest and trustful dialogue with our counterparts in China. So I don't think megaphone diplomacy through politicians such as myself is going to add to that. If anything, it'll detract from it. We need to have great relations and honest communications with all of our near neighbours, including China. They've done, I think, a pretty good job of the way they've been dealing with it in country to date, and I don't want to say anything that's going to interfere with our ability to respond and to respond appropriately.
Thank you to both of you. Good luck, getting through the Parliament sitting over the next couple of weeks.
Thanks, Patricia.
Good to be with you.
Lots of